She stood still as the dust settled around her feet, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, the other gripping a few thin sheets of paper that felt heavier than stone. Divorce papers. Outside a modest, weather-worn home, under a sky that offered no comfort, she watched the man who once vowed to protect her turn his back without hesitation. He didn't look at her stomach. He didn't ask about the child growing inside her. He didn't pause. He simply walked away, his arm wrapped around another woman. Laughter low, confidence loud, as if he had just escaped a burden instead of abandoning a life. To anyone watching, the story seemed simple. A poor woman, a failed marriage, a man who chose better. In this neighborhood, appearances were everything, and her appearance said she had lost. No fancy car waited for her. No influential relatives rushed to her side. No wealth, no power, no protection. Just silence. Just shame. Just the slow ache of being discarded when she needed support the most. But what if the man who walked away believed she had nothing, only because he never knew the truth? As he disappeared down the road with his mistress, dressed in confidence and promise, the narrator asks a question that lingers in the air like unfinished thunder. What if the life he rejected carried a secret so large, so carefully hidden, that it could rewrite everything he thought he knew about power, wealth, and worth? Her father had died only weeks earlier. A quiet man. A simple man. A man the husband openly mocked in life and dismissed in death. He left you nothing, the husband had said, his words sharp, his tone final. No inheritance, no land, no money. Just memories and old lessons about patience, humility, and silence. Lessons the husband laughed at. Lessons he believed proved weakness. What no one knew, what no one ever bothered to question, was that the father's simplicity was not failure. It was camouflage. Behind the modest clothes and quiet routines lived a man who owned empires without putting his name on buildings. A man whose wealth moved through shadows, through trusts, land, and investments spread far beyond the imagination of those who judged him. One of the wealthiest men on the continent, living as if he had nothing at all. And now he was gone. The husband believed the story ended there. A pregnant woman with no father, no money, and no leverage. Easy to discard. Easy to replace. Easy to forget. But some stories don't reveal their truth at the beginning. Some wait. This is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about greed that miscalculates, patience that endures humiliation, and a reversal so complete it leaves silence where arrogance once lived. It is about a man who walked away too soon, and a woman who said nothing because she didn't need to. Because when the truth finally rises, it doesn't shout. It lets regret do the talking. In this city, people learned early how to read worth from the outside. The shine of a car, the cut of a suit, the size of a house, these were the things that spoke loudest. Power was respected, but only when it announced itself. Silence was often mistaken for weakness, and humility for failure. It was an African city alive with movement and ambition, where success was paraded and poverty was judged without mercy. Few believed that true power could exist without noise. She had grown up differently. The woman had been raised in calm, not luxury. Her father taught her to greet everyone with respect, to listen more than she spoke, and to never chase validation from crowds. He never wore expensive clothes. He never boasted. Yet wherever he went, people greeted him with a quiet seriousness she never fully understood as a child. To her, he was simply a gentle man who valued discipline, patience, and dignity over display. Now he was gone. She mourned him in silence, carrying grief in her chest and new life in her womb. Pregnancy had softened her body, but strengthened her resolve. Even after the divorce, even after being cast aside, she never spoke badly of her husband. She focused on survival, on the child growing inside her, and on honoring the lessons her father left behind. In her eyes lived sorrow, but also something steady, something unbroken. Her husband saw none of that. To him, her simplicity became an embarrassment. He was ambitious, hungry for recognition, obsessed with rising quickly in a world that rewarded image over integrity. Each time he attended gatherings with powerful men, he compared his wife to theirs and felt ashamed. She didn't dress expensively. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't demand attention. And in his mind, that meant she lacked value. The mistress represented everything he thought success should look like. Confident, flashy, always surrounded by attention. She spoke of connections, opportunities, and fast money. She dressed like the future he wanted to belong to. Standing beside her, he felt visible, important, respected. What he never questioned was how shallow that visibility truly was. When the father died, the husband expected a turning point, something to prove him wrong. Instead, there was nothing. No grand estate, no sealed vault opened in public, no sudden wealth, just a quiet burial and unanswered questions. The husband concluded what he already believed. The old man had lived small and died empty. What he didn't understand was that some lives are designed to be misunderstood until the right moment. This story is not about poverty or wealth. It is about judgment, about the danger of measuring people too early, before time reveals what silence protects. Because when we decide someone's worth too quickly, we often destroy our own future without even realizing what we've lost. He was known in the neighborhood as a quiet man, so quiet that most people barely noticed him at all. He wore the same simple clothes year after year, favored plain sandals over polished shoes, and drove an old vehicle that never drew attention. He greeted people politely, but never lingered in conversation. If someone didn't look closely, they would assume he lived an ordinary life, one shaped by limitations rather than choice. But to his daughter, he was everything. From her earliest memories, her father spoke softly but deliberately, as if every word carried weight. He never rushed decisions. He never reacted in anger. When others argued loudly, he listened. When people bragged, he smiled and changed the subject. At home, there were no signs of wealth, no luxury furniture, no expensive decorations, no obvious savings hidden away. Yet there was always enough. School fees were paid on time. Medical needs were never delayed. Emergencies never caused panic. As a child, she once asked him why they didn't live like other families who had bigger houses and nicer cars. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because noise attracts thieves, he said gently. And greed attracts destruction. She didn't fully understand then, but she remembered the calm in his voice, the certainty. He taught her lessons that felt old-fashioned in a world obsessed with speed. He warned her never to judge people by what they show publicly. Some people shout because they are empty, he told her. Others stay silent because they are full. When she brought home stories of classmates showing off their parents' wealth, he reminded her that wealth without wisdom was a temporary costume. Never rush to admire, he said. Time tells the truth better than people do. There were moments, small, easy-to-miss moments, that hinted at something more. Sometimes, late at night, his phone would ring. Not often, but when it did, he always stepped outside to answer. His tone changed, not louder, not prouder, just firmer. On more than one occasion, she overheard him saying very little. Yet the person on the other end listened carefully, respectfully. After those calls, he would return to the house as if nothing had happened, washing his hands, asking her if she had eaten. Once, when she was a teenager, a convoy of unfamiliar vehicles stopped briefly near their street. Men in tailored suits stepped out, scanning the area before approaching their gate. They bowed slightly when they greeted him, not deeply, but unmistakably. Their visit was short. No raised voices, no arguments. When they left, the street returned to normal, and her father went back to trimming the small plants in the yard as if nothing unusual had occurred. She asked him about it later. Just people from work, he replied, without elaboration. Inside the house, there was one room she was never allowed to enter without him, the small study at the back. It was always locked. When he did open it, she saw shelves of neatly organized files, folders marked with codes instead of names, and a heavy safe built into the wall. He never explained what was inside. He never needed to. His authority in that moment was gentle but absolute. As she grew older, she began to notice how often people sought his advice. Market leaders, community figures, even people who looked far more successful than he appeared would stop him on the street, greeting him with a mixture of familiarity and restraint. They listened when he spoke. They thanked him when he finished. None of them ever spoke loudly around him. Still, he never claimed importance. When she met the man who would later become her husband, her father welcomed him with courtesy but caution. He asked simple questions about patience, about long-term plans, about values rather than income. The young man answered confidently, speaking of ambition and speed. Her father listened without interrupting, then smiled politely. Later, when she asked what he thought, he said only, "Ambition is good. But ambition without humility burns bridges before it builds roads." She didn't realize then that it was a warning. As the years passed, her father's health quietly declined. He never complained. Even on days when his breathing was heavy, he sat upright, dressed neatly, and insisted on walking himself to the door. In his final months, he called his daughter into the study for the first time and handed her a sealed envelope. "Not yet," he said firmly when she reached for it. "The right time will come." When he died, the world responded with indifference. No headlines, no public tributes. The funeral was modest, attended by a few people whose expressions carried more respect than grief. The husband noticed it too and misread it completely. He saw proof of insignificance, proof that the old man had lived quietly because he had nothing worth announcing. What no one understood was that the quiet father had spent his entire life preparing for moments exactly like this moment when truth would need protection from greed, when patience would matter more than power, and when silence would be the final test. The audience feels it before it's revealed. This man did not live small. He lived hidden. At the beginning, the marriage looked like a promise fulfilled. He had pursued her with intensity, drawn to her calm nature and the way she listened without interrupting. To him, she felt different from the women who demanded attention and measured affection by money spent. He called her grounding. He told friends she made him feel focused, centered, as if life with her would be simple and purposeful. For a while it was. They started modestly, in a small apartment furnished with necessities rather than dreams. She woke early to prepare meals, supported his ambitions without complaint, and believed deeply in building together. When he spoke about his plans, business ideas, career leaps, connections he wanted to make, she listened with genuine faith. She never pressured him to move faster. She trusted time. But time did not move the way he expected. As months turned into years, his impatience grew. The promotions came slowly. The recognition he believed he deserved did not arrive on schedule. And in the spaces where gratitude once lived, comparison quietly took its place. At social gatherings, he began to notice other men's wives. Their jewelry sparkled. Their clothes announced status. They spoke loudly, confidently, drawing attention wherever they went. When his wife stood beside him, simple, respectful, understated, he started to feel exposed. He told himself it was her fault, that her background made him look small, that her father's quiet life reflected failure rather than wisdom. At home, his words changed. What kind of man lives his whole life and leaves nothing behind? He asked one evening, referring to her father. The comment was casual, almost careless, but it cut deep. She said nothing. She had been raised to respect elders, and more importantly, she believed silence preserved peace. She reminded herself that marriages survive storms when one person stayed calm. He began mocking her simplicity, her clothes, her refusal to chase trends. "You don't act like a modern woman," he said once. You don't understand how the world works. Each comparison chipped away at the love that once felt natural. Each remark made him feel superior and her feel smaller. Still, she remained loyal. When his business ideas failed, she comforted him. When money became tight, she adjusted without complaint. When others praised him, she celebrated quietly. When they criticized him, she defended him fiercely, even when he was wrong. She believed that character outlasted circumstance. That patience would be rewarded. He believed the opposite. To him, patience looked like stagnation. Loyalty looked like weakness. Silence looked like submission. He wanted visible progress, fast cars, louder respect, immediate validation. And slowly, almost unnoticed, resentment replaced affection. The first time he spoke to the woman who would become his mistress, he felt something shift. She admired his ambition. She laughed at his complaints. She agreed when he blamed his wife's background for his slow rise. She dressed like success and spoke like certainty. Around her, he felt important again. He began to spend more time away from home. When his wife asked questions, she did so gently, never accusing. She trusted honesty more than surveillance. He took advantage of that trust, telling himself he deserved more than what his marriage offered. He began to believe he had married beneath his potential. Her father's death sealed his judgment. At the funeral, the lack of visible wealth confirmed everything he thought. No powerful figures stepped forward publicly. No luxury cars lined the street. No large inheritance changed their life overnight. To him, it was proof of failure passed from father to daughter. That same week, he started speaking openly about needing a fresh start. When she told him she was pregnant, she expected softness, hope, renewal. Instead, she saw disappointment. A child, to him, meant delay, responsibility. Another reason he couldn't leave immediately, but also another reason to blame her for holding him back. He withdrew emotionally, then practically. The mistress grew bolder. His cruelty became sharper. Through it all, she remained quiet. Not because she was weak, but because she believed love didn't need to shout to survive. She believed dignity mattered more than arguments. She believed her father's lessons, that rushed judgments destroy futures, and that those who measure worth by display often misunderstand power entirely. What she didn't know, what he would soon learn too late, was that the illusion he built his marriage on would become the very reason everything he thought he was gaining would eventually slip through his hands. Death came quietly, the same way the old man had lived. There was no long illness that drew attention, no dramatic final words spoken in front of an audience. One morning, he simply did not wake up. The house felt different, immediately emptier, heavier, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreplaceable had left. For his daughter, the loss was physical. It settled in her chest, tightened her breath, and made the world feel unfamiliar. The one person who had always been steady, who had never raised his voice, yet somehow commanded respect, was gone. The funeral reflected his life, modest, controlled, and brief. There were no luxury tents, no long speeches, no public displays of wealth. A few people attended, most of them quiet, reserved, their expressions unreadable. Some stayed only moments, offering condolences with a depth that words didn't explain. Others stood at a distance, observing rather than participating. To anyone expecting spectacle, it looked like the burial of an ordinary man. Her husband noticed everything and misunderstood all of it. He scanned the gathering for signs he believed should be there. Influential figures, expensive cars, visible proof that the old man had been someone important. When none appeared, his disappointment turned into certainty. To him, the absence of noise meant absence of value. As they left the burial ground, he shook his head slightly, as if confirming a long-held belief. "That's it," he said later, not bothering to lower his voice. "A whole lifetime, and this is all he leaves behind." The words hit her harder than the loss itself. She said nothing. She was too exhausted to argue, too hollowed out by grief to defend the man who had never needed defending in life. Instead, she withdrew inward, mourning in the way she had been taught, quietly, privately, with dignity. She wore black. She prayed. She remembered her father's voice reminding her that not every truth needed to be explained. Her husband, however, felt relieved. The death confirmed what he had already decided. There would be no inheritance to wait for, no hidden fortune to change their circumstances, no reason to stay loyal to a woman whose background, in his mind, offered no future. He grew colder, less patient, more openly dismissive. Grief annoyed him. Her sadness felt inconvenient. During this time, the mistress became more visible. She called him more often. She showed up uninvited, speaking confidently about plans, opportunities, and the kind of life she believed he deserved. She mocked the funeral openly, laughing at the simplicity of it all. "If that's what success looks like in your wife's family," she said once, "then you're wasting your potential." Instead of defending his wife, he agreed. While his wife mourned her father, he began emotionally detaching from his marriage. He stayed out late. He stopped asking how she was coping. He treated her grief like a phase that should have already passed. And when she tried to talk about her father, about the memories that haunted her, he shut her down. "He's gone," he said sharply. "Move on." She felt alone in ways she had never imagined. The house that once felt safe now felt temporary. Yet even then, she clung to hope not for herself, but for the marriage she still believed could be saved. It was during this fragile period that she discovered she was pregnant. The news startled her at first, then filled her with cautious optimism. A child, she believed, might soften him, might remind him of responsibility, of roots, of the family they had once dreamed of building. When she told him, her voice trembled, not with fear, but with hope. His reaction crushed that hope almost instantly. He did not smile. He did not embrace her. His expression tightened, as if calculating cost rather than life. He asked questions about timing, about finances, about what this meant for his plans. The warmth she expected never came. Still, she tried. She imagined the child as a bridge, something that could pull him back from resentment and reconnect him to love. She spoke to her growing belly at night, promising stability even if she had to provide it alone. She believed that patience, once again, would be rewarded. Meanwhile, the mistress grew bolder. She questioned the pregnancy openly, suggesting it was a trap. She pressured him to choose, framing the situation as a crossroads between ambition and obligation. And slowly he began to see his unborn child not as a blessing, but as a burden, another tie to a life he had already decided to leave. The disrespect toward her father turned into disrespect toward her. He dismissed her emotions. He mocked her mourning. He spoke of the future as if she and the child were temporary obstacles rather than permanent realities. In his mind, the story was clear. The old man had left nothing. The daughter had inherited nothing, and the marriage had reached its limit. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the absence of visible wealth was not the end of the story. It was the pause before the truth. As the woman sat alone some nights, grieving her father while feeling her child move inside her, she remembered his final words, his calm insistence that some things reveal themselves only when the world is ready. She didn't yet understand what he meant, but she trusted him enough to wait. And while the husband dismissed the dead as insignificant, fate quietly began rearranging the living. The decision did not come in a moment of rage. That was what made it crueler. It came calmly, deliberately, as if he had rehearsed it many times in his mind before finally saying the words aloud. He told her one evening, sitting across from her at the small table where they had once planned their future. His tone was flat, almost businesslike. He said he was tired of waiting, tired of being patient, tired of carrying the weight of a life that wasn't moving fast enough for him. He looked at her stomach, not with concern, but with irritation, and said what he had already convinced himself was true. "You're holding me back. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. She felt them before she fully understood them. Holding him back from what? From responsibility? From loyalty? From the vows he had made? She wanted to ask, but her throat tightened. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the answer didn't matter anymore. He spoke of the mistress openly now. He didn't bother to hide her name or soften his intentions. He said she understood him, that she believed in his ambition, that she had connections, opportunities, access to a better life. He said this marriage was a mistake made when he didn't yet know his worth. And then he said he wanted a divorce. She did not cry in front of him. She did not beg. She did not remind him that she was carrying his child. The dignity her father had taught her rose instinctively, like armor. She listened as he justified himself, as he rewrote their history to make himself the victim. In his version of the story, he had been patient. He had tried. He had waited long enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "If you have already decided," she said, "then there is nothing left to discuss." That calm unsettled him more than anger would have. For a moment, he hesitated, then hardened again. He told her the papers would come soon. He told her she would need to move out. He told her she should be grateful he was being honest. The mistress wasted no time claiming her victory. She appeared publicly at his side almost immediately, dressed in confidence, smiling as if the future already belonged to her. She spoke loudly about plans, about travel, about the kind of life they were going to build together. She did not acknowledge the pregnant wife, except with thinly veiled satisfaction. To her, this was proof that ambition always won. The divorce papers arrived while the wife was alone. She held them in her hands for a long time, feeling the weight of the finality they represented. Each page felt like an erasure, not just of the marriage, but of years of loyalty, silence, and sacrifice. When she signed them, her hands did not shake. She refused to give the moment more power than it deserved. She packed quietly. No dramatic exit, no confrontation. She folded her clothes carefully, paused over small items that carried memories, then placed them back where they belonged. She took only what she needed. When she left, she locked the door behind her gently, as if respecting a space that had already forgotten her. The community noticed immediately. Whispers followed her steps as she walked through familiar streets. Some pitied her. Others judged her. A few assumed she must have done something wrong to be abandoned so completely pregnant, fatherless, and alone. In a society where a woman's worth was often tied to her marital status, her fall felt public and irreversible. She has nothing now, people said. They saw no husband, no father, no visible support. They saw a woman returning to her mother's home with a growing belly and no explanation. They did not see strength. They did not see strategy. They saw loss. Her husband, meanwhile, felt relief. Free from what he called limitations, he embraced his new life eagerly. The mistress encouraged him, praised him, pushed him to cut ties completely with the past. He convinced himself he had made the right choice. He told friends that some people were meant to be left behind so others could rise. He never looked back. The wife endured humiliation quietly. She avoided gatherings. She kept her head down. She focused on her pregnancy, on protecting her child from the bitterness around her. At night, she cried in silence, not from regret, but from the weight of injustice. Still, she remembered her father's voice reminding her that storms reveal character, not destroy it. To the world, she had lost everything. Her marriage, her reputation, her security, her future. What no one realized was that she had also lost the need to explain herself. And sometimes, that is the beginning of true power. As the whispers grew louder and the husband's confidence grew bolder, something unseen shifted beneath the surface. The betrayal marked an ending, but it also marked a turning point. Because while everyone else believed the story was finished, it had only just begun. And the silence she carried was not emptiness. It was patience, waiting for its moment to speak. The summons arrived quietly, without drama or explanation. It came weeks after the divorce, on a morning that felt like all the others, slow, heavy, and uncertain. She was staying in a small room at her mother's house, folding baby clothes she had been given by neighbors who pitied her situation. When her phone rang, she almost ignored it, assuming it was another call offering sympathy she didn't have the strength to receive. The voice on the other end was calm, formal, unfamiliar. They asked for her by her full name, the one few people used anymore. They said they represented a legal firm she had never heard of. They said the call concerned her late father. And then they asked her to come in person. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Her father had left nothing. That was the story everyone believed, including her husband, including the community, including herself. There had been no announcement, no visible inheritance, no public documents. Still, something in the caller's tone stirred a memory. The locked study, the sealed envelope, his words, "Not yet." When she arrived at the address they gave her, her confusion deepened. The building was not modest. It stood in a part of the city she had rarely visited, where decisions were made behind glass walls and quiet corridors. She adjusted her simple dress, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked, and stepped inside. The men who greeted her did not look at her with pity. They stood when she entered. They spoke respectfully. They offered her a seat and water before saying a single word. And then, slowly, carefully, they began to explain. Her father, they said, had been many things the world never saw. For decades, he had owned interests in companies that bore other names. He had invested in land across multiple regions, registered under trusts designed to last generations. He had stakes in global markets, holdings spread across borders, protected by layers of legal insulation. He had been involved in ventures that required discretion, not publicity. And all of it, every asset, every share, every document had been planned with intention. He had not lived quietly because he lacked wealth. He had lived quietly because wealth attracts danger. They showed her records, carefully organized, meticulously dated. Businesses she recognized only by reputation. Land she had passed by without knowing it belonged to her family. Accounts that had grown untouched for years. The numbers were staggering, almost unreal. Her hands trembled as she turned each page, her breath catching with every revelation. Her father had been one of the wealthiest men on the continent, and he had trusted almost no one with that truth. Then they explained why none of this had been revealed earlier. He had written specific instructions into his will conditions that delayed its execution. The inheritance, they said, was never meant to arrive easily or early. It was designed to wait, to watch, to test. He had known that wealth revealed too soon would attract greed, not just from outsiders, but from those closest to her. He had known that her marriage would face trials. He had known that patience would be demanded of her in ways she could not yet imagine. The will would activate only when she faced true adversity without retaliation. Only when she had lost visible protection. Only when she had been stripped of comfort, status, and support, and still chosen dignity. Only when she was carrying the next generation. Her pregnancy had triggered the final condition. Tears blurred her vision as the truth settled in. Her father had not abandoned her. He had protected her far beyond his lifetime. Every insult her husband had thrown at him, every dismissal, every assumption of failure, her father had anticipated it all. He had trusted time to expose character better than confrontation ever could. But the inheritance came with conditions. They were not demands of control, but principles of protection. She was not to retaliate against her ex-husband. Not publicly, not privately, not through humiliation or revenge. She was instructed to remain silent, to let consequences unfold naturally. Any attempt to use the wealth to shame those who wronged her would violate the trust. Her father had written this clearly. Let life correct people. Allow your read aloud. Revenge teaches nothing. Time teaches everything. The wealth was also to be used with purpose. A portion was reserved for her child's future education, security, and legacy. Another portion was designated for community investment, schools, healthcare, women's empowerment. The rest was placed under her control, but only with advisors chosen by her father people who valued restraint over excess. She sat in silence as they finished. The room felt smaller, heavier, as if it contained not just wealth, but responsibility. This was not a gift meant for celebration. It was a burden meant for stewardship. And suddenly, every lesson her father had ever taught her made sense. Silence was not weakness. It was preparation. When she left the building, the city looked the same, but she knew it was no longer seeing her clearly. She returned home quietly, said nothing to anyone, and continued living simply. The lawyers respected that. They moved slowly, discreetly, exactly as her father had intended. The world still believed she had lost everything. And for the first time, that misunderstanding felt like protection rather than pain. She placed her hand over her belly that night and whispered to her unborn child that their future was secure, not because of money, but because of the patience that had guarded it. The will had waited, and now so would she. The change did not arrive with celebration or announcement. There were no press releases, no sudden displays of wealth, no dramatic shift that the community could point to and say, that is where everything changed. The transformation unfolded the way her father had always taught her, quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention. She began with education. Not the kind that chased titles, but the kind that built understanding. Private tutors were arranged. Advisors carefully selected by her father years before met with her in modest offices. Never at home, never in public. They spoke to her about finance, governance, law, and long-term planning. They didn't flatter her or overwhelm her. They treated her as a steward, not a beneficiary. Each lesson felt like a continuation of conversations she had once had at her father's table, now expanded into the language of power. Security followed, but invisibly. She was protected in ways she never noticed, movements monitored, risks anticipated, problems resolved before they reached her. Her lifestyle did not change outwardly. She still dressed simply. She still lived quietly. She still moved through the world without attracting attention. That anonymity became her greatest advantage. Then came the work. The first hospital was built in a rural area far from the city. It didn't carry her name. It carried her father's principles, access, dignity, and sustainability. Medical equipment arrived without ceremony. Doctors were hired and supported without conditions that demanded praise. The community benefited without knowing who had made it possible. Schools followed. Small at first, focused on girls and children from families that history often overlooked. Tuition was covered quietly. Teachers were paid fairly. Curriculums emphasized discipline, critical thinking, and self-worth. Again, no names. No photographs. Just impact. Women's funds came next. Loans for widows, grants for single mothers, training programs for women rebuilding their lives after abandonment. Each initiative was structured to restore independence, not dependency. She read every report. She approved every major decision. She refused any project that centered her image over its outcome. In powerful circles, people began to notice the pattern. Resources were moving efficiently. Projects were succeeding where others had failed. Money was being used without ego. The question arose quietly. Who is behind this? Her name began appearing in conversations, not loudly, not publicly, but with curiosity and respect. When people finally met her, they were often surprised. She did not look like what they expected power to look like. And that disarmed them. No one connected her to the pregnant woman who had been divorced and discarded months earlier. Her past remained sealed, not by force, but by irrelevance. She did not correct assumptions. She did not explain her history. She let people meet her where she stood, not where she had been. Meanwhile, the husband's new life began to unravel. The mistress enjoyed attention, but lacked patience. She spent quickly, demanded more, and grew frustrated when the connections she promised didn't deliver lasting success. She pushed him to take risks he didn't understand, to impress people who didn't respect him. He realized too late that confidence without substance was fragile. Their marriage, built on appearance, lacked foundation. Arguments replaced excitement. Blame replaced partnership. When his plans failed, there was no quiet support-only criticism. The same ambition he once admired now felt like pressure. The same lifestyle he chased now demanded more than he could sustain. People began to notice his instability. Doors he thought were opening closed just as quickly. Opportunities slipped away. His reputation suffered, not because of sabotage, but because of inconsistency. The powerful circles he tried to impress valued discretion and reliability, qualities he had never learned to practice. He heard her name once, not as his ex-wife, as someone influential. The mention unsettled him. He dismissed it at first, assuming it was coincidence. He never imagined the woman he left behind could exist in rooms he couldn't enter. The idea didn't fit the story he told himself to justify his choices. And so he continued downward, unaware of how close their worlds had moved without touching. She, on the other hand, continued upward without noise. She never used her wealth to correct the past. She never sought to confront betrayal. She let results speak where words would have cheapened the lesson. Each hospital opened, each school succeeded, each woman rebuilt her life. Those were her answers. At night, she still lived simply. She spoke to her child about responsibility, about humility, about patience. She taught by example, just as her father had done. The cycle continued not of wealth, but of wisdom. Power surrounded her now, but it did not define her. Silence still did. And while the world slowly learned her name, it never learned her pain, because she had already transformed it into purpose. The rise was complete. And no one heard it happen. The reveal did not come with thunder or accusation. It arrived dressed in calm, measured dignity, exactly the way her father had always said truth should arrive. The event itself was one of the largest the city had seen in years. A landmark land acquisition tied to a multi-billion-level development project, hospitals, housing, infrastructure, and long-term investment that would reshape entire regions. Government officials were present. International partners sat at polished tables. Cameras lined the walls, waiting for names that already carried weight. The husband attended because he believed this was the kind of room he belonged in. His new wife stood beside him, elegant and alert, scanning faces, calculating status. She whispered names to him, people she claimed to know, people she hoped to impress. They both believed this evening might finally be their breakthrough, the kind of visibility that would pull them back into relevance. Then the program began. Speakers talked about legacy, about responsibility, about development that outlives applause, about wealth that builds rather than consumes. The language felt different from the loud ambition the husband was used to. It was quieter, heavier, more deliberate. And then her name was announced, not with spectacle, not with exaggeration, simply, clearly, with respect. She walked onto the stage dressed simply, her posture calm, her presence undeniable. For a moment, neither the husband nor the mistress recognized her. The context didn't allow for old assumptions. This was not a woman being introduced because of who she married or where she came from. This was a woman being introduced because of what she controlled. The moderator explained her role in the project, how the land had been acquired, how funding had been secured, how long-term planning had already begun years before the public ever heard a word. Then came the sentence that froze the room. She was introduced as the sole heir and steward of one of the largest privately held empires on the continent, a trillion-level legacy, The air changed. The husband's mind struggled to reconcile what his eyes were seeing with what his pride had insisted was true. He looked again and again. The shape of her face, the stillness in her expression, the unmistakable familiarity he had erased from memory. It was her, the woman he divorced while she was pregnant, the woman whose father he mocked, the woman he dismissed as a burden. The mistress stiffened beside him, confusion turning quickly into disbelief. She whispered his name sharply, demanding an explanation he did not have. Her confidence faltered, replaced by panic as she realized what this moment meant. Every insult he had ever spoken replayed in his mind without sound. A man who left nothing. You're holding me back. I deserve better. None of it needed to be answered, because she didn't look at him. On stage, she spoke briefly not about herself, not about wealth, not about power. She spoke about patience, about long-term thinking, about protecting the future instead of consuming the present. She honored her father without naming him, describing him only as a man who believed silence could guard truth better than noise ever could. The audience listened, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. When she finished, applause rose slowly, then fully, not the kind fueled by excitement, but the kind born of recognition. People stood, not for drama, for substance. The husband remained seated. Around him, people whispered not about his presence, but about hers. Doors he had chased for years were opening for her effortlessly, not because of spectacle, but because credibility follows consistency. She stepped down from the stage and moved through the room with grace, shaking hands, exchanging words that carried meaning rather than flattery. Executives leaned toward her. Leaders asked for meetings. Decisions were being made quietly, efficiently, exactly the way power prefers to move. She passed close to him, close enough for him to speak if he dared. He didn't, because what could he say? She didn't confront him. She didn't expose him. She didn't acknowledge his betrayal publicly or privately. She didn't need to. The truth stood between them, complete and untouchable. To confront would have lowered her to a moment she had already outgrown. The mistress watched her disappear into rooms she would never enter, realization sinking deep and bitter. The better life she promised had been built on illusion. The future she imagined had collapsed without a single word spoken against it. That night, headlines would be written. Names would be searched. Histories would be rewritten. But none of that mattered to her. She returned home quietly. She held her child. She honored her father's legacy, not with revenge, but with restraint. The man who left her believing she had nothing finally understood the cost of judging too early. And the woman he abandoned proved what her silence had always protected. True power does not argue. It arrives. And it lets regret do the remembering. In the end, the lesson did not arrive with punishment or public humiliation. It arrived the way truth often does quietly, after all the noise had exhausted itself. Wealth, the narrator reminds us, does not always announce itself. Real power rarely enters a room loudly. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides behind patience, behind humility, behind lives that look ordinary to those who only know how to measure worth by appearance. And when it finally reveals itself, it does not argue with the past. It simply stands undeniable. The husband learned this lesson too late. He had believed that success was something you could recognize instantly, that it wore expensive clothes, spoke confidently, and arrived early. He believed that anyone who moved slowly must be falling behind. Anyone who lived quietly must have failed. Anyone who endured in silence must have nothing left to lose. And so, when he looked at his pregnant wife, mourning a father who left no visible inheritance, he saw limitation, not legacy. Only later did he understand what he had truly divorced. Not just a woman, not just a marriage, but a future shaped by discipline, foresight, and depth he never learned to value. He had walked away from a lineage built on restraint, from wisdom that outlived applause, from a legacy designed to endure rather than impress. By the time he realized this, the distance between who he was and who she had become was too great to cross, not because she blocked the path, but because life had already closed it. There was no confrontation, no final conversation, no apology dramatic enough to rewrite history. Regret, when it comes too late, does not demand attention. It settles quietly and stays. The wife never looked back, not because she was cold, not because she had forgotten, but because her future demanded her full attention. She looked forward to her child, to the next generation, to the responsibility her father had placed in her hands long before the world knew her name. She taught her child the same lessons she had been taught: that patience is not weakness, that dignity does not need witnesses, and that silence is sometimes the strongest form of self-respect. She did not raise her child on stories of betrayal. She raised them on principles. She showed them, by example, that pain does not have to become poison, that loss does not require bitterness to be meaningful, that revenge may feel powerful in the moment, but patience shapes destinies that revenge never could. The community, once so quick to whisper, eventually grew quiet. They spoke her name with respect, then with curiosity, then with understanding. Some felt shame for their judgments. Others learned without admitting they had ever doubted her. And that, too, was enough, because her life was no longer a response to what was done to her. It was a continuation of what had been planted long before. African tales often remind us that destiny does not rush to prove itself. It waits until character is tested, until choices are made without reward, until silence has done its work. Only then does truth step forward, not to explain, but to reveal. In this story, silence spoke louder than confrontation. Dignity outlasted humiliation, and destiny arrived exactly on time. As the final moments fade, the narrator leaves us with a question that lingers longer than the story itself. How many people do we abandon because we judge their present, without knowing their future? Fade out slowly, because in the end, the loudest lessons are not shouted. They are lived, and they always speak last.